Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today, and thanks for the opportunity for Rabobank to sponsor this event. This is one of our longest standing sponsorships, and we really enjoy this conference. And I think one of the reasons why is there's always, I think, this steely resilience from the dairy sector. It's a sector that's had highs and lows for a number of years, and no more has that resilience been tested probably over the last 12 to 18 months. But I'm sure that's absolutely the same resilience that we'll see it come through strong out the other side. Look, in terms of my presentation here today, I want to I'm not going to touch on COVID. I think COVID's obviously something that's significantly impacting the industry right now, but I think at a more higher general level, there's some changes happening both here domestically in New Zealand and globally that long term are going to have a much more significant impact on this industry and all other ag industries here in New Zealand. So just touching on why I think we're going through a transformational period of change in New Zealand, what some of those impacts might be, what some of the outcomes could be, and then sort of finishing off, again, when you're focusing on you, what does that mean for you and what can you focus on? I always struggle with these. Green one? Oh, yeah, one in the middle, the obvious one. So as I said, I think we're going through a period of transformational change now. There's rules being written both here in New Zealand and globally that are going to define what we farm, where we farm, and how we farm over the next generation. Here in New Zealand, and those rules are being written now. That they have been I think over the last 5 years, and will continue to be written at least over the next five years. I spoke at the Dare conference about 5 or 6 years ago in Napier, and the focus there was very much around freshwater regulation and some of the impacts that will have. That's obviously still a very live and relevant issue, but I think what struck me is that the breadth of not just the different environmental challenges we've had down the pipeline, but the different influences that are coming. So as I said, we all know about the regulatory pressure here in New Zealand. We've had fresh water. We know greenhouse gas is kind of next cab off the rank. We know we're moving towards 2025 with some kind of pricing mechanism and increased reporting on our greenhouse gases. Biodiversity is another one that's very much live and very much, I think, another area we'll see more involvement from regulators in the very near future, and animal welfare is just an ongoing space we'd expect to see tightening of regulation. But I think what's probably struck me in the last 2 years is we're seeing actually other influences starting to really have an influence in this space, and one is in that market space. And when I'm talking the market, I'm not actually necessarily talking about consumers. What I'm talking about is those major food companies and major food buyers. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen them come out with pretty bold statements and ambitions, particularly in that greenhouse gas space. So if you see Nestle, they've committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. JBS, the world's largest protein producer, carbon neutral by 2040, and around a 46% reduction in their greenhouse gases across the supply chain by 2030. Why is that important? Because if you read the language, they're talking about the supply chain. They're not just talking about their own footprint of their processing facilities. They're talking about the whole supply chain that they're sourcing their product from. So if you look at Nestle, a large proportion of that environmental footprint will come from our dairy farms on New Zealand. So if they move towards that 2050, if they want to hit some of those targets, I'd expect to see increasing pressure push down the supply chain to see what that change can look like. And that's coming, partly again from the consumers, but it's not just being driven by consumers. It's more that broader concept of that social license to operate. These companies are coming under increasing scrutiny from NGOs, from the public themselves, and that's why they're trying to get out in front and make these statements. Now, setting the targets is the easy bit. I'm still unsure of necessarily some of the pathways they're going to achieve those targets, and I think to Dennis's point before, this is an area where greenwashing is something that they will need to be very conscious of going forward now that they've got those targets out there. The third area that's obviously very relevant to us and it's probably snuck up over the last 12 months is actually what's happening in the global capital markets. So I'm not sure how many of you guys know this this guy on the screen here, Larry Flink. So he is CEO of BlackRock, which is the largest funds manager globally in the world. And at the start of each year, he releases a letter to all the other fund managers, sort of CEOs, sort of saying, where he sees things happening over the next 12 months, where are the developments, where are things shifting, where to invest, where not to invest. In the last 2 years, that letter has had incredibly strong language around this concept of a shift in capital away from industries or behaviours within industries that are considered non-sustainable towards investments that are considered sustainable. He himself's committed to divest of their coal investment, for example, and coal, and fossil fuels is probably the most obvious space. But increasingly, I'd expect this to be picked up and applied across different sectors. We haven't seen it to date in the ag sector to a huge extent, a little bit, if there's certain nitrogen limit restrictions or something in parts of New Zealand, that's pretty obvious. But this is sort of more a fundamental concept of, what's considered good and sustainable and increasingly capital flowing there. And for those activities or sectors that aren't considered sustainable, finding it harder to access that capital. Now, one of the challenges in doing this, and this actually applies across all those three, the regulators, the markets, and the capital markets, is actually defining sustainability. And that's one of the biggest challenges we've got in agriculture. It's pretty clear with fossil fuel what's sustainable and what's not. We've seen it, in transport's another example. It's pretty clear cut. But it's a lot harder to define, what is sustainable production in agriculture, and then how do we actually go around measuring and monitoring and reporting on that. But I do expect to see an increased movement in that space going forward. So what does this change? Essentially, this changes around agriculture needing to incorporate its environmental impacts into its operations more and account for those environmental impacts. Now, some of those impacts are negative. We know with nitrogen leaching, we know with greenhouse gas emissions, there's going to be some kind of limits placed around those. Others are positive. We know farming can sequester carbon. So we see now there's some form of reward for that. And this, I think, is sort of what we're going to see increasingly going forward. This creates obviously both risks and opportunities. I probably don't need to go on to people in this room too much around the cost. There's both that direct cost, whether that's cost of complying with fencing regulations, whether that's a cost associated with having to pay for methane emissions. But also there's the opportunity cost. We simply won't be able to develop land or produce off our land in the same way that we would have done otherwise without these limits and restrictions. The other big one is complexity. Farming is becoming an incredibly more complex operation. Increasingly, we're required to collect information and data. We're collected to report on it to regulators. Activities we used to be able to do of right, winter grazing, for example, we've now got to turn our mind to, well, do I need to get a resource consent for that? What percentage of the paddock is pugging? How far are my setbacks? If I do need a resource consent, what information do I need to supply and how do I go about it? So it's coming an incredibly more complex operation. I do think there's opportunities, though. I do think there's opportunities for efficiencies as we look harder in our operations and look to increasingly match it to sort of the natural capital of our operations. How can we drive more efficiencies out? And I'll touch on soon. I think we will increasingly get the tools to do that. I've already touched on there will be new income streams. At the moment, it's very much in that forestry space, but potentially there may be other ones to recognise that the positive impact that farming has. And I've already touched on briefly here, this is aligning up with what the markets are asking for. And this isn't me saying, well, we're going to go get a premium for what we've got, but at least it is what consumers are demanding. And increasingly, our competitors will face some of those other pressures I've talked about. Maybe not the domestic regulation, but they'll face the same pressure from the Nestle's. They'll face the same pressures from the capital markets. So in some sense, it can actually be a comparative advantage for New Zealand if we get this right. At an individual level, it won't impact all farmers or growers in the same way. And I kind of use this graph here to sort of illustrate. I kind of break it into three areas. There's those that are sort of compliant now for whatever reason, where they're farming, what they're farming, the way they're farming. There won't actually be a lot of impact from these changes going through. I think there's a big chunk in the middle, though, that it's very much around they're not there yet, but if they make the changes, implement the good management practices, tick some of those boxes, they will get there. Probably the more concerning chunk for the sector and the industry is what we call the challenge 10%, and I don't know if it's 10, 15 or 20. And these are those groups that, despite their best intentions, despite all the tools and management options out there, simply can't get to where the regulator wants them to get to and still have a viable business. And that's not necessarily a fault of their own. They may have made investments at a time that it was quite legitimate to expect they'll be able to continue producing in the way they had, but now simply can't. In terms of, defining those impacts, I think we can look at, first of all, obviously, the form of the regulations has a big impact. So the form of the regulation will impact, just how much does this one impact the sector? But secondly, how does it impact, different subsectors within the agricultural environment? Because again, not all sectors will be impacted the same way. It depends which environmental impacts we're focusing on. Okay, we're very much focused on nitrogen today, increasingly greenhouse gas emissions. But if we chose to focus on other environmental issues, in Europe it's very much in the chemical space. So if we're looking at restrictions around use of chemical, that would probably potentially impact other sectors more than the livestock sector that very much feels it in the nutrient space. It's how we choose, some of those allocation frameworks, again, around nitrogen, how we're going to set up the incentives around greenhouse gas emissions and how they're priced, and also just some of those farm practices and some of the regulations around telling us exactly how to farm. Is that still an output-based regulation that allows that innovation and change to happen to encourage some of those positive practices, or is it increasingly that European sort of inputs-based control where you reduce the freedom to actually innovate and get where we need to get to? You're simply doing what you're told to do. In terms of the individual factors that will really define how individual farmers are impacted, I kind of break it again in my head into, three different lots. One is land use intensity. If you're running an operation that has more environmental impacts, the risk associated with tightening regulations and limits and restrictions is probably more likely to impact you. The second one is sort of the natural characteristics of the land. So your soil, the climatic conditions, topography, access to water. There's certain mixes within there that will sustain higher levels of production and can absorb some of those environmental impacts more than other combinations of that. I think one of the real challenges we've got there is actually probably the science or understanding exactly what that combination looks like and which sort of natural characteristics can really absorb those impacts more than others, and that's an area I think we need to look at more. In the third one, the receiving environment, this is very much in the water quality space more than greenhouse gas emissions, but there's some catchments or areas in New Zealand that are more degraded or under more pressure. So farming in those areas are likely to see more restrictions in place. So it's kind of the combination of all those factors that will really start to define, which of these categories, they're compliant now, the not yet but soon or challenged will fall into. I've sort of, to date, sort of thought about that graph there as, where do we fit now and how do we change that going forward? But increasingly, again, given we're going through this transformational period, I think we need to think, investments we're making now, farm systems changes we're making now, how well set up am I going to be in 10, 15 years, given that direction of travel that I've explained before, is likely to mean we need to account for more of the environmental impacts within our farming system. Again, I can't give certainty around exactly what the form of those regulations look like. I started with the bank 8 years ago, sort of advising them what was happening in the freshwater space. I don't think we're any closer to certainty in freshwater than we were now, and I expect in 8 years' time we won't be any closer again. I think the direction of travel is clear. The actual details itself will ebb and flow due to political pressures, economic pressures, and environmental society pressures. So I won't get too hung up on the necessarily trying to visualise what those hard rules will be. But again, that direction of travel, I think, is pretty clear. What does this mean for New Zealand going forward? What are some of the impacts? Again, I think the environment will increasingly be a driver of land use and farming systems, but also increasingly a driver of the innovation and where we focus some of that R&D in the innovation space. Essentially, what these restrictions are doing, what these limits, what these new costs are doing, is changing the underlying economics of different land uses across New Zealand. For some, where those limits are posing a cost on for example, nitrogen leaching or increasingly greenhouse gas emissions, which is very much that livestock sector, this represents, as I said, a new cost. So that will change some of those underlying economics. For a sector like horticulture that doesn't have some of those, and again, I'll admit horticulture is a pretty broad church, but aspects of horticulture that doesn't have that intense nitrogen leaching, comparatively that becomes a more appealing investment because you don't have those costs associated with it. So I do think we'll see more horticulture. And saying that, there's some pretty major structural barriers to horticultural change in New Zealand around development of an appropriate market, access to water, access to labour, post-harvest infrastructure. So if that's a road we want to go down, we'll need to tackle some of those hurdles. And the other one is, I absolutely believe there will be more forestry in New Zealand. We're seeing it very much here and now. And again, that comes back to we're looking to reward what we see as the positive impact of farming can have, sequestration of carbon. Now, the way our rules are written at the moment, the only recognition we're going to get there is if it fits within that box of what's a forestry block within the ETS. Whether that changes forward, I don't know. What I will say is if things aren't changed, we will see significantly more of sort of the broad-scale blanket whole-of-farm approach in forestry. Again, the fundamental economics of it just dictate that we're going to see more of that. Now, I actually think forestry can be a real positive opportunity for the livestock sector. You know, it enables us to complement, aspects of our farming system with a new income stream. But unless we get those policy settings right to actually provide that right incentive, we're at a risk of losing significant tracts of our land. And I'll touch on that soon. The other area is innovation. I think now that there are again, costs associated with some of these environmental impacts, we're starting to see the investment in technology that will make us sort of environmentally more efficient producers, so enables us to produce the same or more whilst either reducing or maintaining our environmental footprint. I do think we'll get much better with tools that enable us to use some of that data and information that we're now needing to provide to regulators or our processes to actually help inform some of our decision-making going forward. I know there's some tools out there at the moment, but I think we've probably got a wee way to go until they're sort of user-friendly enough to really enable broad-scale use within the sector to really inform some of those decisions. And I also think we will see investment in just, again, more tools and technology. So Holter with the cow necks that mean virtual fencing is now increasingly becoming commercially viable. And what struck me with something like that is it wasn't just, well, we don't need to fence off our waterways, but it meant the use of four-wheelers was reduced. So there's also, there's a greenhouse gas element, there's a health and safety element, there's actually multiple benefits that can start to come out. I think we've got to realise we're very much at the start of that curve, though. A lot of these technologies are either in the early stages of development or in early stages of adoption, and we're, again, at the moment, probably not cost-effective necessarily, and potentially not that easy to use. But again, as we look over that time frame for 5-10 years, these will become increasingly mainstream. I think, we've probably already touched on it in a wee bit, getting these policy settings now right is vital to the long-term success of not just the industry, but I think New Zealand generally. I've said we're going through a transformational stage. I think it's sort of similar to the 80s in some ways. Obviously, there's some significant differences, but I think where it is significant is this potentially will impact our national identity, and it can impact the communities we're operating in if we get this wrong. So we do need, policies and legislation that's very well thought out, that's practical, fit for purpose, and really does avoid some of those unintended consequences. So if you look at the climate change report, I actually think there's some really good stuff in there around talking around, using efficiency gains to get some of these reductions in emissions while maintaining production levels, which is great. But the industry will need to support to do that because that's a big ask to maintain the level of efficiency gains we've had over the last 20, 30 years, whilst now doing it this new environment where we're significantly more restrained in what we do. So, we need support in terms of people capital, making sure we've got the right skills, both within the farm gate or beyond the farm gate, whether that's your scientists, whether that's your marketers, whether that's your engineers, really attracting that talent into the industry. Technology, I've already touched on why that's important. Infrastructure, whether that's, rolling out of broadband across the rural network so we can really start to use some of those tools in that, I was talking around data collection and information, whether that's infrastructure for post-harvest in the horticultural sector. And we do need to sort of look at, if we are going to restrict how much we can produce from our traditional livestock sector, what are some of the other options that farmers are going to have to potentially integrate into their farming system and really leverage, parts of their property to maybe get new sources of income. Next point I've already touched on, but we have to be very conscious that we're not unnecessarily restricting the future generations of New Zealanders to produce food, because essentially, that's what we're about as an agricultural country, is producing food. Now, if we don't put those changes in place, I think we are, again, at a real risk of losing large tracts of land for some short to medium term gains. But it's that next generation that comes through that won't have the options as a consequence. And recognition of carbon removal within the farming system that sit outside the ETS. Now, I realise that's not necessarily that easy with some of the tools and measurement approaches we've got at the moment, but we need to invest in those so it does become easy to measure within the farming system, all those sources of sequestration and to get recognition. Because if we're opposing a cost on one arm, we've got to be fair and actually recognise and balance it out with the positive attributes on the other hand. I really like that the theme of the conference is, focusing on you, because there's a lot of the stuff that we can't control. Some of it can, some of it through our lobbying and getting involved and engaging in some of those regulatory changes that are happening. But if you bring it down to the sort of the core principles of what you can do, it's understanding your long-term risks and opportunities. Again, understanding your mix of the intensity of your farm, some of its natural characteristics, where you're farming. How does that line up? And potentially thinking of these limits going forward. What does that mean for your operation? And incorporating that into your long-term planning and decisions. It's quite common, people say, well, I don't want to do too much till there's a bit more clarity around what's going to happen in relation to different regulations. And I get that. I think that's fair. But there's no harm in, assessing now, at least from a risk perspective, where do you stand? So you can move and you know which levers to pull when you need to pull those levers. As I've already said, I do think, those data collection tools will become increasingly relevant to farming because of the volume of information that you'll be able to be required to collect and provide to different entities. So being able to progressively integrate that into your farming system and then potentially using that again to inform decision making. And mindset. And again, I don't think this is a new mindset because I think farmers have, by and large already have this mindset. But, good environmental management of your property is just a good core part of good farming going forward. And again, that's not new. That's something we're already doing. But we need to, again, keep coming back to those core principles. So I know I'm right up against my 11:45. So again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present here today and enjoy the rest of the conference.